When the book of Exodus opens, we are reminded how the Israelites ended up in Egypt to begin with. That if they didn't go down to Egypt, they would have died of famine in the land of Canaan. And so they go down to Egypt. But it all goes horribly wrong. I mean, it starts off great. Joseph finds himself in sort of the vice presidency of Egypt. He's in a place of position of power and authority. And so when his brothers come down, he's able to bestow upon them land and opportunity. His father comes down. They make for themselves a great name and a great nation there. 70 strong, they come down and they multiply into the tens and then hundreds of thousands. Joseph's a big shot in Egypt. But then Jacob dies, and then his brothers die, and then the brothers die, and then Joseph dies, and then the whole generation in one verse dies. And then we read that verse that we pointed out last night and has been pointed out to us as Rabbi Brown mentioned last night. You don't pick the Parsha. The Parsha sometimes picks you, and it's an amazing element of beshert when there is a coming together of what's happening in our world and what's happening in our Torah at the same time. Vayakam melech hadash. And a new Pharaoh arose, a new king arose who didn't know Joseph. To not know someone in Torah is a matter of moral valiance. To not know something is not just to not understand it, to not be able to conceptualize it. To not know something in Torah is to be intentionally disconnected from it, to turn away from it, to say, I'm not interested in that. Because all things are knowable, so if this is not known, it means you didn't want to know. Rashi says that it's not that Pharaoh had never met Joseph. We're not talking about a meeting here. This new king had intentionally tried to forget Joseph. Willful ignorance, fueled by an agenda. Pharaoh, our new king, actively erases the memory of our people and its contribution to Egyptian society and culture, and indeed the pyramids that surround them. He doesn't know from Joseph who saved the land of Egypt, and our people is erased and seen to be worthy of fear now. He erases the memory of the immigrants that came and built the pyramids, that built the store cities of Pithom and Ramses, that saved the grain, that saved the people. And he fans a fear of foreigners in its place. And then he says, let us deal with them with chokhmah, with wisdom. But it's not the kind of wisdom that we think of in Talmud. It's a cunning Machiavellian wisdom. Let's fool them. Let's be strategic, he says, and outwit them lest they become the majority and displace us. Let us put Egypt first at all costs. The new Pharaoh goes further and initiates a system that will support his nefarious narcissism. Let's throw their firstborn male children into the Nile. Let's kill them. But the women resist. They rebel. Today we would say they march in protest. First, it's Shifra and Puah. We read in Torah that Pharaoh says to them, these are the midwives, and they're referred to as Hebrew midwives, but it's not clear in the text, and I think it is intentionally ambiguous whether they are midwives to the Hebrews or they themselves are Hebrews. I'll assume that they are Egyptian, but you could read it almost either way. Avram will correct me later with my dikduk, with my Hebrew grammar. But Pharaoh says, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, you shall look upon the child, and if it be a son, then you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she may live. By the way, if you count the characters in that verse of Torah, it fits within a tweet. But the midwives feared God and didn't do as the king of Egypt commanded them. Instead, they saved the children, the male children. And again, back to that question of were they Hebrew midwives, Egyptian midwives to the Hebrews? And some, I would say, think it is intentionally unclear, to show that heroes need not be from our own tribe or our own kin. But either way, they risk it all. They risk it all and will give their lives to save these children. But Pharaoh's decree is still the law. And one couple has the audacity of hope and puts their child not in the Nile, but in a basket to float down the Nile. And so we enter our third heroine, Bat Paro. She doesn't have a name, just the daughter of Pharaoh. She sees the basket first. She sees it. Her maidservant brings it to her. She opens up the basket. She sees a child in the basket, a boy crying. Now, she has to know at this point, there is no way that this is not a Jewish child. There is no way that this child floating down the Nile is an Egyptian child, just happened to find its way into a basket. Jewish children are sentenced to death. Male children are sentenced to death all over Egypt. She knows in that moment what she sees. She knows in that moment that this is a Hebrew child sentenced to death by her father. And she has compassion, ocular empathy, a compassionate gaze. Now, we have to pause here for a moment because we're going to get Moses in a little bit later on, and then the whole rest of the Torah is sort of Moses, Moses, Moses. But when we arrive at Moses later in the story, one verse teaches us who he was. Vayigdal ayeled, and a boy came up. He grew up. Vayetze, and he left. The first exodus is Moses leaving Pharaoh's house. Vayar, and he saw his people. He went out to his brothers. Vayetze, he went out to his brothers. Vayar, and he saw what was happening to his people. His mother saw. The Hebrew midwives, they saw. Bat Paro, she saw. Miriam saw as she watched him float down the Nile, and Moses sees. Aviva Zornberg says, Moses sees in a way that allows him to be affected by what he sees. His seeing is an act of empathy. Pharaoh's seeing is an act of dominance. Pharaoh sees weakness and opportunity to divide. Moses sees opportunity to save and to heal. He saw suffering, and he went out to them. In this context, we understand who Moses is and what leadership means in Torah. Now, none of us know what the new king who has arisen will bring. But we have seen much, and we have heard much, and we should be alarmed. David Brooks, writing yesterday in the New York Times, wrote the following 3 paragraphs. We have never, ever, over our centuries, speaking to the American people now, inaugurated a man like Donald Trump as president of the United States. You can select any random group of former presidents, Madison, Lincoln, Hoover, Carter, and none of them are like Trump. We have never had a major national leader as professionally unprepared, as intellectually ill-informed, as morally compromised, and temperamentally unfit as the man taking the oath on Friday. So let's not lessen the shock factor that should reverberate across the extraordinary moment. It took a lot to get us here. It took a once-in-a-century societal change, the stresses and strains brought by the global information age. It took a political system that was too detached, too rigid, too unresponsive to understand and to deal with all of that. Our new king is not Moses. But this is not the end. Because I know that the vast majority of the American people see with eyes, with ocular empathy, that are trained to see and to feel the cries of others. It's not the end because I know that more people voted against him than voted for him. And that many of those that voted for him did not vote for the hatred or the racism. They voted because they felt unseen. They felt unheard. They too felt that America had forgotten Joseph. This is not the end because I know that just as there are remarkable women, 3 remarkable women, just as they put themselves on the line for life in Torah, so too women and men will always risk, and will always fight for what is right, for what is just, for what needs protecting. We are evidence of that, and we are doers of that. This is not the end because I know that we have been here before. We have been in the Mitzrayim, in the narrowness of Egypt. That's what the word Egypt means, Mitzrayim. It means narrowness, narrow place. And we have been under the lash of an indifferent Pharaoh. And we were redeemed. Our Torah was written out of that experience. Our Judaism was shaped and continues to be shaped through the lens of having been slaves and been strangers ourselves. This is not the end. Rather, like Shifra, like Puah, like Bat Paro, like Moses, it must be the beginning of our seeing. Can you hear Ratzon? May it be God's will. Amen. Thank you. Our service continues, page 586. We rise for Elenu.